Hey everyone, DJ Short here from RotoWorld, joined by Eric Samolsky, and this is our fantasy baseball Q&A. We took a couple of weeks off with the 4th of July holiday, but we are back, and I think at a good time too, because we have this big influx of prospects coming in the majors this week. A couple we've seen before, but another nice infusion, kind of unexpected. I wasn't thinking it would be this quick that we would see some of these names, but exciting nonetheless. We also have the MLB trade deadline coming up, so a lot going on in the baseball world, but still some time to catch up on your fantasy teams as well.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the influx of prospects. I mean, basically 3 announced in one day for the Pirates, who, it feels like another lifetime ago that we were just waiting for them to call up O'Neill Cruz, and it seemed to take forever. And this year they've been a little bit more aggressive with the promotions. And then, the Reds, the surprisingly contending Reds, have made a lot of interesting moves. So I think that, that's been a really nice change in baseball over the last, calendar year or more, is just seeing so many more prospects get the opportunity. And I think we're struggling as a fantasy baseball community with what to do with that. Because we're used to so few prospects coming up that they get so aggressively bid on, in fab periods. And now you're seeing just money thrown week after week after week. And I think we might need to calm ourselves down and realize that, these kind of promotions are going to be coming far more often. And we might need to be a little bit more cautious with how we spend that money on rookies.
I thought it was interesting when I did NL only labor this season. It was salary cap draft, and there were some aggressive bids for prospects and there's some unique rules with labor and how you can start players and keep certain players on your bench and that sort of thing. And there were some aggressive bids for prospects. And at the time, I think Ellie De La Cruz was one of them.
Right.
And of course, in March, you're like, who knows if they'll even be up in the majors this year. Yeah. But especially in a league like that, having that kind of in reserve there, especially in a league-only type of format, I think I've learned my lesson here. Like, why not take a shot on a prospect like that who could pay off later down the road, especially when teams are, like you said, being increasingly more aggressive in terms of prospect promotions.
Yeah, I think – you mentioned earlier on that we are seeing some guys get promoted. We're seeing some guys get re-promoted, multiple chances, right? I know you may have been referencing Grayson Rodriguez, in particular, like Edward Julian is crushing in July for the Twins. He's been up and down like 3-4 times. He was somebody who a lot of fab bids were spent on the first time he came up, and then increasingly less and less and less. And, that's another dynamic of prospects is, if they're not a guy like Ellie De La Cruz, who's, he's not getting called up to get sent back down. But, some of these guys are going to get yo-yoed a little bit. And we forget about them when they come back up the next time. You may see Vientos in a couple of weeks. And it may be a very different situation for the Mets than the first time you saw Vientos. And people may just decide, may ignore it completely. And, that could be an opportunity to get him at a necessary discount. So there's a lot of interesting things when you're dealing with these prospects in a long season.
Right. And the Mets are a team who should sell. Whether they will, we'll see. But I think there's obvious players they should be selling here, a Tommy Pham, a Mark Canha, the late inning relievers that they have. So let's say that does happen. I think we're likely to see, assuming the Mets do kind of wave the white flag, they should probably designate Vogel back for assignment. They should clear spots for some of these younger players. And that does include Mark Vientos. He should probably be a DH. It doesn't necessarily have a position. But I think the interesting one for the Mets is Roddy Mauricio, who isn't an infielder. I think that's been determined at this point, but has gotten some time in the outfield in AAA. Had a really bad June, but he's perked up a bit again this month. I'd be fascinated to see him get a chance down the stretch.
Yeah, I think, I play in an OPS league where he has, a little bit more value there because of the pop in his bat. There's some swing and miss, which can, impact him in a batting average league. But the fantasy goodness stats are certainly there. And you'd like to believe, again, if the Mets do, wave the white flag to a certain extent, that when he comes up, he's coming up to play. And you mentioned, Canna moving on. I think, Tommy Pham has hit his way into being an actual trade piece at the deadline. For a contender, he could, be a starter against lefties or, bench bat or whatever, but he's played really well. And I think that's opening up, people want to talk about whether they'll trade Starling Marte. And I don't really know if they would go that direction, but it just still opens up at bats for Mauricio. And on the year, you mentioned he cooled off in June a little bit, but on the year you're looking at a 299 average with 14 home runs and 14 stolen bases.
Right.
And last year had 26 home runs and 20 stolen bases. So that kind of stuff is useful in almost all leagues.
Yeah, the problem with a team like the Mets is that they're players who, have the track record, a Scherzer, Verlander, even a Marte. They're just so expensive that it would take Mets eating a good amount of that salary to get any player value back. And then you're looking at the Mets for next year, where their rotation is not good. Like if they were to trade a Scherzer, Verlander, and they still, look at themselves as contenders going into 2024, and you don't have a Scherzer, Verlander at the top of that rotation, there's a Quintana who's getting older. Like what are they going into next year if they trade any of these pieces?
Yeah, I think the most you're going to get would be dealing one of Scherzer, Verlander. I don't think there's a way for the Mets to contend next year if you get rid of both of those guys. And then, Senga is your ace heading into 2024. And you have basically nobody else in the starting rotation on the payroll. So I think that there's definitely some moves they're going to make, but I don't think they're going to be as aggressive as some people think.
Yeah. And let's talk about the Yankees, because there was a tweet from, I think it was an ESPN account earlier today, just referencing the Yankees are in last place. It's been, 30 years since they've been in last place this late in the season. They are only 2.5 games out of a wild card spot right now. So it's great for like clicks and laughs and all that kind of stuff, but the Yankees are still very much alive in the playoff race. Whether they're a good team moving forward, I'm not so sure about that. Without Aaron Judge, they are just a futile lineup there. But they're one or two things going their way away from legitimately being a playoff team in the American League. I think it's going to be really interesting to see what the Yankees do also. Yeah,
I think if anything, they buy more than they sell, right? I mean, I do think, they're not going to be without Judge, or they're going to be without Judge until at least August. And who knows how far into August. So there is a world where the next 2 weeks are really rough. And it just doesn't look likely. But I don't see that being the case. I mean, this team has remained competitive enough. I think there's no way they fall far enough out of the wild card, in my view, in the next couple of weeks to say we're just going to, pack up shop. I think Donaldson is done. That grade 3 calf sprain, but all the comments just make it seem like he's not healthy, but also I don't think they feel rushed to, bring him back. So you'll probably see Peraza get more at bats. So you're getting a little bit of like that youth there. And, that's also an opportunity to like, do the young players push them to compete, or are they not going to really be competitive, but now they just get more of these young guys in the lineup a little bit?
Do you see the Yankees trading for Bellinger or something like that? Because I clearly this lineup needs something.
I think the rumor, the current rumor has linked them to Dylan Carlson. And what you hear from a lot of Yankees writers is that they checked in on Bellinger and the price was just too high, which is understandable, from the Cubs' point of view, given what he's doing right now. He's probably the top bat to acquire at the deadline. I'm not including Shohei Ohtani because I don't really think that that's entirely realistic. So the Cubs can ask for whatever they want, especially, right up until the deadline. But, the Cardinals came out and said Tyler O'Neill is going to be their everyday left fielder. They want Newt Barr in center. They said that Jordan Walker needs to get consistent at bats. So that leaves Dylan Carlson without a home. So either they're saying Tyler O'Neill needs to be their everyday left fielder to convince teams that he's crucial to them and, not make lowball offers. And maybe they do want to move on from O'Neill because that situation's been super weird this year. Or maybe they do want to get rid of Carlson. And I know Yankee fans think that they need another left-handed bat in the lineup. Carlson's a switch hitter, could buy low on a guy who used to be a top-tier prospect who's maybe now just could grow into a solid big league outfielder. But that's better than, Willie Calhoun, Billy McKinney, Isaiah Kiner-Falefa, whatever the Yankees are throwing out there.
Yeah, so since coming off the injured list in early June, Dylan Carlson has a .432 on base percentage in 95 plate appearances. So it's not very high, but that is kind of crazy. Almost as many walks as strikeouts, hitting .260, not a ton of power, but like you said, this is still a young player. He is he's only 24 years old. Is that right?
Wild. Yeah.
Yeah, that's wild. And yeah, he's not far removed from being considered a top 100 prospect, and some of the Cardinals valued very highly. But the Cardinals are another one of those teams, and Mozeliak, I believe, said it yesterday that they view themselves as sellers, which is so weird for the Cardinals to be in that category because we are just so accustomed to seeing them in October every year. One way or another, they figure it out and they get there.
Yeah, and it's interesting if the Yankees were to make a deal like that, because obviously one of their deadline deals last year was to get an outfielder from the Cardinals when they landed Bader, who's been good for them when healthy, but that's kind of always the story with Harrison Bader. I think they need to keep the ship afloat to see, getting Rodon back was great. They need Severino to kind of figure it out a little bit. I know, Nestor Cortez is seemingly on his way back at some point in the, coming weeks future. I know they still have hope for Frankie Montas, in the end of the summer, maybe as kind of like a late season push. So if they can stay in it and they can get Cortez and or Montas back, make a slight little improvement to the lineup, they're possibly a playoff team. I just don't think they're deep enough to be like a legitimate contender. So then you just go through the question of like, how much are you willing to give up at the deadline if you're really not a true World Series contender?
Yeah. So looking at the wild card race in the American League right now, it's the Orioles, it's the Blue Jays, it's the Astros. Those are your three wild card teams. Red Sox a game and a half back. Yankees 2.5 games back. So this is very tight. It could go any number of ways. The Astros have dealt with all sorts of injuries to their rotation and also to their lineup. Jose Altuve has been banged up a great majority of the year. Of course, the injury in the World Baseball Classic. Yordan Alvarez, they hope to get back soon. I believe he's starting a rehab assignment this week, so he should be back pretty soon. But I don't think we've seen the Astros at their best. I think the Astros need to acquire a starting pitcher in the next couple of weeks to really give a big push here for a playoff spot. I thought going into the year, the Blue Jays were the best team in this division. Obviously been proven wrong by the Rays, and the Orioles for that matter, who I think are arriving sooner than a lot of us expected. I think the Orioles are another team who needs to go out and get a starting pitcher.
They need to. Yeah, I mean, we've said, I feel like we've kind of said for a couple of years, there's some really interesting bats, but they never make moves for pitching. They sign the Kyle Gibson types. And it never felt like they were, from the pitching side, never felt like they were making moves that suggested they were a contender. but they are right now. And it's great that, Grayson Rodriguez is back up. Bradish has looked really good of late. Tyler Wells continues to be a really reliable starter. But, you're going to go into a playoff push with Kyle Gibson and Dean Kremer in your rotation. It's not super confidence inducing. And, I think they probably thought that DL Hall would come up and join the rotation, late in the season. And that's not working out.
Right.
He's struggling right now in AAA with, a 4.57 ERA. The walks are kind of out of control. So I think that there's nothing on the horizon in prospect wise. So they have a surplus of hitting prospects. And especially, listen, if Ryan Mountcastle is going to only start versus left-handed pitching for you, then you should maybe try to deal him and get a reliable starter, because he's still a useful bat for a lot of teams. The Mets would probably love him as a DH.
That's a good point. So when I think about starters available going into the trade deadline, of course, there's the pie in the sky, Shohei Ohtani. I still think it's possible, but probably unlikely. But it's one of those things, like if a team calls the Angels at 2:00 on August 1st and is like, here's two of our top prospects or whatever, like anything is possible, right? I think the Padres too. I think if someone blows them away for Blake Snell, it's a possibility, but I'm not sure the Padres are going to go that far. So if you're looking at the top of the market right now, you're talking about Marcus Stroman, you're talking about Lucas Giolito. I think those are the two pitchers most likely to be dealt by the deadline here.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. And listen, like we've seen it happen in the past. There was a time where I think it was where the Yankees traded Chapman at the deadline and then signed him back. And there is a world in which the Angels kind of make a deal with Shohei Ohtani where they're like, look, we're not going to make the playoffs this year. We'd love to have you for the future. Hopefully, Trout back healthy again. But we need a little more juice to get us there. If we were to trade you for the final 2 months of this year and could load up a little bit, we would make you a lucrative offer in the offseason and our team could be better positioned. Right. But it's a risk, right? But from the Angels' perspective, it's also like it's no riskier than just going into the offseason and hoping you can re-sign him. Like it's a risk for everybody. Now, does a team really want to give up their top 2 prospects plus maybe some major league ready players for potentially 2 months of Ohtani with no assurance that he's going to re-sign? I could only see a handful of teams doing that. And those are teams that are in an immediate position to win, because if you win the World Series this year, you can say it's worth it. Again, like if it's the Mets, is he enough? Like there are holes. Is he enough really to make you think that you're a World Series contender? And I know that Steve Cohen probably just thinks I'll get him here and then I'll never let him leave. But who knows if they can make that work?
Right. Yeah, exactly. So let's hop into the prospects who were called up this week. The Pirates, they did get thrashed last night. Andy Rodriguez went 0 for 4 with 3 strikeouts. Quinn Priester actually started out pretty well, and it kind of fell apart from there. And there's Leo Verpagero was called up too, who nobody's talking about, but he was once a top 100 prospect too. So 3 interesting names added to the mix there with the Pirates. I mean, I think it's obvious Andy Rodriguez is the one everyone's paying attention to fantasy-wise. But what are you thinking? What's your approach with Rodriguez right now?
I think definitely just a 2-catcher league option for me at the current moment. I think, he has really good understanding of the strike zone and really good kind of contact rates. And so I think that he will probably run a usable batting average for a catcher. He was hitting 268 in AAA. It was his worst full-length season since he's been in the minor leagues. And weirdly, he had 25 home runs across multiple levels last year and had 6 this year. So something is going on where he's not getting the production that he had in the past. Makes me a little more hesitant to really go all in. But again, striking out 15% of the time, walking 11.4% of the time.
That's really good.
Makes a lot of contact. But, a lot of contact in a mediocre lineup where you're not going to put up huge counting stats, and you're probably not getting a lot of power right now, even though, again, I mentioned he had 25 home runs last year. It's just not here right now.
Right.
I mean, is that really any better than what you're getting from, I picked up there's Jake Rogers is on the waiver wire in a lot of 2-catcher leagues, Matt Tice from the Angels. Connor Wong has been out there seemingly forever for the Red Sox. Those are guys who I think might actually be just as good, if not a little better than Endy Rodriguez for the rest of this year.
Right.
So I wouldn't go crazy. I'm a little more interested in Peguero, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
Because he had 13 home runs and 21 stolen bases this year. He stole 28 bases in each of the last 2 years, and he's probably going to get everyday run as a shortstop. And another guy whose batting average probably won't kill you. So I think he could be an interesting source of speed in deeper leagues for the rest of the year.
Yeah, I picked him up in Tout Wars mixed draft this weekend in Fab because I'm interested in that speed. That speed's going to play. Gives you a little bit of category juice there. I'm not sure about Rodriguez with the power. I was actually reading something on MLB.com. I believe it was in their prospect section when they did a little capsule on Rodriguez's season. His hard hit rate in AAA measured there was 31.6%. So that's percentage of batted balls with exit velocities above 95 miles per hour. So that number, 31.6%, that would be last among Pirates qualified hitters. So when you're wondering why the power hasn't been there for Rodriguez this year, I mean, that's somewhat telling here. What that means for him going forward, who knows? Jordan Walker, when he came up, was hitting everything on the ground, and the Cardinals, retooled the swing. It seems like he straightened some things out. I think Rodriguez is promising enough and young enough that we should have some patience there. But I'll throw one at you with the Pirates. Henry Davis or Endy Rodriguez, who would you rather have the rest of the season?
Henry Davis by a long shot for me. Hoping that obviously he's catcher eligible in a lot of leagues, even though he is not a catcher right now for the Pirates. And I think probably is just not a catcher. I don't know that he's going to catch, especially now that Rodriguez is up. He's caught one game since coming up for the Pirates. I think there's a very realistic chance that he doesn't catch enough to qualify at catcher next year, which will be interesting for his fantasy value. But yeah, I mean, I trust the power. Weirdly, I trust the power more with Henry Davis, even though his minor league track record is not what Endy Rodriguez is. He's making pretty solid contact. So far for the Pirates, the pull rate is up around 50%. But again, 53.8% ground ball rate so far for Henry Davis, and I know that is trending up in recent weeks, but that's something to keep in mind is you're not going to get a lot of doubles, you're not going to get a lot of homers if you're hitting 54% ground balls. So but I'm a little more interested in that profile than I am in Endy Rodriguez's, and Davis also has 3 stolen bases in his first 24 games. So there's a little bit of chip in speed that could come with that.
Yeah, sprint speed for Henry Davis, 75th percentile, pretty interesting. He's held his own plate discipline-wise, 20.4% strikeout rate, walking 10.2% of the time. The hard hit percentage is 44.6%. We just mentioned Endy Rodriguez is around 31% in AAA this year, so there's a difference there as well. I agree with you on Davis. I just hope that he does get 5 games behind the plate this year. To keep at least eligibility in Yahoo moving forward. That would be huge for his value next season. I think a lot of people will probably be looking at him as a fantasy sleeper, assuming he does get those 5 games behind the plate, at least in Yahoo formats, which are a lot more position friendly. So another player we should talk about who's called up here, Christian Encarnacion Strand, the latest prospect to join the fray there with the Reds. Of course, we know the outstanding numbers that he had in AAA, hit 331, 20 home runs, 1042 OPS, over 67 games in AAA this season. But the big question is where does he play? How often does he play? What's your approach with Strand? For me, it's just like, let's see how it plays out. You stash him. Let's just see how it shakes out. But I think it's going to be one of those things you have to just like watch the lineup day to day.
Yeah, I mean, you'd like to believe they wouldn't call him up if he wasn't going to play regularly, right? But again, we've referenced Mark Vientos before, and we've seen teams call players up and start them off in kind of like short side platoons. Obviously, it's if you have Christian Encarnacion Strand, it feels good that they started him against a righty in Logan Webb last night in his first start, which would indicate he's maybe not a short side platoon. Spencer Steer has been struggling of late, so maybe Encarnacion Strand gets regular DH at bats. And you got Ellie De La Cruz at third and India at second, and Votto's over at first, and McLean at short, and it could shake out like that. So I it wouldn't surprise me if the Reds still kind of like did this rotation, with Steer and Fraley and Benson and Friedel, and just kind of like rotated through some of those guys, which maybe has me a little more tepid on Encarnacion Strand than I would be if there were no obstacles to his playing time. Because I think he made a lot of changes to his profile in AAA that have me feeling really good about him.
Right. So question here from Foxborough News, two Reds in this question. Ozuna, Fraley, or McLean, 10 team head-to-head points league. How are you feeling about this?
I feel like I want to say Matt McLean. And only because there's a couple things worry me about Fraley. We just talked about obviously the the glut in Cincinnati, which could lead to playing time concerns, even though Fraley has been great. They may decide, they could get more for him in a trade. They may, keep Friedel and Benson and those guys. And I just, Ozuna, the start of July hasn't been great. I felt like June was a little bit fluky based on his batted ball metrics. I know he hit well. His numbers look good in June, but it seemed like he was kind of overperforming. And I just really like Matt McLean. I like the power speed combo he gives you. I like that he hits at the top of that lineup, which is now like a pretty good and deep lineup. So I think I would lean there.
Yeah, I agree. And, McLean, he's striking out a little more than you'd like to see. The strikeout rate is creeping up to around 30%, which isn't great. But I think what you like about McLean is that he's a pretty good defender. He's rated out pretty well in terms of outs above average, has a good arm. And like you said, brings that speed to the table, too. Baseball Savant has him at 91st percentile in sprint speed. You love the lineup, you love the ballpark, but I think that defense is a big factor that's going to keep him in there among the the ups and downs that are inevitable with a prospect when they come up to the majors. So I would agree with you on that one. Next prospect I want to ask you about, Grayson Rodriguez, of course, came up with a lot of hype. First off, he didn't make the opening day roster, which a lot of Orioles fans and fantasy managers were upset about at the start of the season. He did come up very quickly, but we saw some struggles. ERA north of 7, a lot of walks, a lot of home runs. Came back last night, pitched pretty well after really a great stint in AAA. He deserved to come back. Cole Irvin, who was the Orioles' big acquisition in the rotation during the offseason, moved to the bullpen. He really hasn't gotten much of a chance in the rotation at all. But Rodriguez has like this rough schedule. So you see the Dodgers in his return here. Next up is the Rays. I think he gets the Yankees after that. So that's a start, right? But Blue Jays after that. So like 3 out of these 4 starts, you're like, do I really trust this guy? It's a tough call for me.
Yeah. I think the Yankees don't scare me, obviously. The Rays don't scare me too much as an offense if I really trust the pitcher. And I think, we know what Rodriguez's talent is. What's interesting to me is, like, if you look at his performance last night, he was 82% four-seam changeup. Was just kind of like throwing those two pitches. And listen, the velocity on the four-seam was up. He was averaging 98 miles an hour, which was up over a mile per hour based on, what he had been doing earlier in the season. Interestingly, the slider velocity was up 2.5 miles an hour, which to me is probably a tweak they made in the minor leagues. But he only threw 8 of them. So, I think there are some interesting things here. Getting, 30% CSW against a strong Dodgers team has me intrigued. I think, where are I think the big question, I'll look it up right now. It's like, where are those starts, right? Because if it's in Baltimore, so Tampa Bay is in Tampa Bay, which I feel, I guess I would roll with it. Tampa Bay, New York are the next 2 ones. And I think that the talent level is good enough. And I think that, those offenses are solid, but not elite, in my opinion, in terms of fantasy.
Yeah, I understand that for sure. So you had a column coming out today on rotoworld.com. Why don't you introduce people to kind of the concept of the article, give a little sneak preview, and they can go check it out.
Sure. But I do want to say, before we move off of prospects entirely, nobody's talking about Trey Cabbage getting called up for the Angels. He started the last 2 games at first base. If this Angels team is legitimately moving on, I think that he has a real shot of being their first baseman for the remainder of the year. He can also play some outfield, which gives him some flexibility. He had a 15% barrel rate in AAA this year. Average exit velocity 91.2 miles an hour, max exit velocity 114. All of that is like 90th percentile and above. And then you pair that with 23 home runs, 24 stolen bases, and a 287 average. 26 years old, so he's not the youngest prospect, but he's not, like a Jake Bauers type. And I think that there's some swing and miss in his game, but I think that, there's some intriguing fantasy potential here. I added him in AL Tout a couple weeks ago and hoped that he would get the call, and he did. And so I'd be trying to grab him in deeper formats on the off chance that he kind of slots into that lineup regularly.
And I think if the Angels sell off some pieces here, maybe not Ohtani, but some of the other pieces there, and we know Trout's hurt, and I just think there are paths here for him moving forward. So I like that too.
Yeah. So the article you're referencing, we're calling it Mixing It Up. And it's basically just a weekly look at pitch mixes, pitch shape, pitch velocity, just kind of looking at pitchers who are making changes during the year that could be a signal of fantasy success in the near future. Trying to keep a sample size to about 3 or 4 starts, so we're not overreacting to just one start. And trying to mix in some deep leagues and some shallow league targets, some trade targets, some waiver guys, just so there's something, for everybody. So this article, which you mentioned you can find on rotoworld.com, is we talked about Yu Darvish, Freddie Peralta, Luis Medina, and Cole Ragans were the 4 pitchers who were discussed. And Darvish right now, it's him leaning more on the breaking balls, the curveball and the slider. The curveball is his best pitch this year, so him relying more on that is intriguing. He's getting more strikeouts. Luis Medina introduced a sinker, which is over the last month the best sinker by Stuff Plus in all of baseball. But the results haven't been there. So, he's now a sinker slider guy. Can that lead to some future success? Peralta is seeing a lot more velocity on the fastball from the beginning of the year, kind of looking a little bit like 2021. Freddie Peralta leaning a lot more on the slider. And then Cole Ragans was traded to Kansas City as part of that Aroldis Chapman deal and came out throwing 97.5 miles an hour in his first start, which was faster than he was throwing when he was just a 2-inning reliever, which didn't really make sense. But it's something to keep in mind. And he's had 2 really good breaking balls this year. So if that fastball becomes even an average pitch, the concept is that he could be a 3-pitch pitcher and a streamer type option. So I go into all that detail with stats and graphics and stuff like that. So if you want the full scope of it, you should check it out.
Awesome. So head to rotoworld.com to check that out. We'll make these Q&As more of a regular thing moving forward. We kind of got knocked out of our schedule going into the holiday. So definitely stay tuned moving forward every Tuesday for the remainder of the season. Thanks a lot for joining me here, Eric. We'll see you guys next time.